Let me give a little bit of background on the webinar, but maybe also for those who don't know the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, or FES in short, that's easier. FES is a German political foundation based on the values of social democracy. We have offices in around 100 countries where we work with civil society actors, with parliaments, with trade unions, with government actors, and often also like academia. We have an office here in Addis Ababa, a cooperation office with the African Union, which was established in 2015. And this brings me now to our debt issue today. We've been working with the African Union Commission since around 2 years on the topic of debt sustainability and sovereign debt. We had commissioned 2 years ago with the EDTIM department at the AU Commission 2 studies where we looked at the debt situation on the country. One of the studies was written or authored by Ma Ekeruche, who is also with us here today and who will present the African debt monitoring mechanism shortly. So yeah, we started working with the AU Commission on the debt issue 2 years ago. Then last year in January, there was a decision by the Executive Council of the AU to look into the feasibility of establishing an African debt monitoring mechanism. So that's where it was first named and or given this name. Since then, the idea was introduced and discussed on member state level several times in SDC meetings, this year in a subcommittee on tax and IFFs here in Addis. And with this webinar, we would like to broaden a little bit the discussion and inform also other actors about the proposal. And get feedback actually on the basic idea, but also get more input on what should be improved, what are maybe still gaps of the proposal. I think I stop here because we have then enough time to discuss the proposal as such. And I would like to introduce now Ma Ekeruche, who is a debt expert and who was our consultant in the project for the last 2 years, and who is also the main supporter with the AU to formulate the proposal of an African debt monitoring mechanism. Ma, would you maybe present what this proposal is about, what the idea is about, and where we stand in the discussion? I think you would have now 15 minutes to kick this off. We have a presentation that we could start now, and then you lead us through the proposal, and then we go into a discussion about that afterwards.
Very lovely to be here. Today, I'll be taking us through a very brief presentation on how an African debt monitoring mechanism can mitigate the debt and expertise, the debt data and expertise gap on the continent. The outline is very straightforward. First, I'll provide a background. Then I will show how debt transparency is weakening, debt data transparency is weakening across the continent, and subsequently how debt reporting performance varies considerably across countries. After that, I would respond to the question, how do we mitigate the debt data and expertise gap on the continent? Then I would briefly discuss where we are now in terms of responding to this debt data and expertise gap and what's the way forward. And I would conclude finally. So a bit of a background. These are recent developments in the debt space on the continent. As a lot of us may know, debt has increased considerably among African countries. Yes, it has across the world, but in particular in the African continent, we've seen rising indebtedness. So government debt as a share of GDP has increased from 38% between 2011 in the 2011-2019 period to 57% in 2022. And that's a pretty significant jump. 20 African countries have now surpassed the 60% debt to GDP threshold that is put forward by the African Monetary Cooperation Program. Um, uh, uh, Countries are facing heightened debt risks. A lot more countries are already in debt distress. 9 countries to be exact are already in debt distress compared to only 2 countries in 2015. And so this has, raised concerns among academia, the research community, policymakers, and technical assistance providers, basically the network of stakeholders that have to do with debt. In addition, while this is going on, so while the continent is experiencing rising indebtedness, there's also an ongoing data revolution in the continent, right? Where African Union member states or African countries are seeking to consolidate the data environment and share data more freely between countries. Um, and at the same time, going back to the debt situation, the interventions that have been put forward by the international community to curb the rising indebtedness have not been as effective as we would like, right? So, for instance, the debt service suspension initiative that was put forward at the peak of the pandemic, it merely stopped the clock on debt service payments. It did not result in any real reduction in debts, right? At the same time, the common framework that was put forward after the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, we've seen how slow, we've seen how long it's taken creditors to come to the table and agree to restructure debt. Out of the 4 countries that have requested participation under the common framework, only Zambia has been, only Zambia's creditors have come to some form of agreement with Zambia to restructure its debts. And so, for these reasons, there's the need for us to look inward as African countries to start putting forward our solutions, or at least making inputs into already existing solutions. Relatedly, there's limited technical expertise on debt issues in the continent. So whether it's with regards to negotiating debt restructuring or to carrying out debt sustainability analysis, not a lot of countries are able to do that. Yes, there are the few countries, South Africa, Nigeria, and a few other countries, Ghana, I think, are well versed. However, for a lot of other countries, there's just this dearth of knowledge on debt issues. Meanwhile, the new developments in the debt service in the debt space, it requires this knowledge, right? It requires technical capacity. So whether we're talking about issuing sovereign bonds, for instance, that are no longer the vanilla bonds, they're now infused with a lot of these bonds are now infused with environmental and sustainability standards, and a host of other areas. There's a fast pace of innovation in the debt space that we are not keeping up with, basically. So, for these reasons, it's very important for us to look inwards and see how we can start to mitigate these gaps. And then finally, and more recently, the African Union joined the G20. So, if the African Union is going to be pushing for uh, uh, the betterment of the continent, and negotiating on behalf of member states, it will need this technical capacity. It cannot go in blind, and so for these reasons, again, there's the need for us to start thinking about how to mitigate the debt, data, and expertise gaps on the continent. Now, this slide basically shows the extent to which African countries publish their debt data. So it's a debt reporting heat map um, done by the World Bank. And what we can immediately see is that there are a lot of reds on the map. So basically, there are countries that do not publish their debt data, and even for countries that publish their debt data, they are also they in some cases they are lacking in other areas. There are certain documents that they don't publish. So just to put numbers to the issues around debt transparency on the continent, 9 countries do not have data on debts, which is very poor when we think about it. 15 countries have no debt management strategy. 23 countries have no annual borrowing plan. And so for these countries, they're just borrowing off the cuff. There's no plan to their borrowing. 17 countries have no data on contingent liabilities. 21 countries have no information on recently contracted loans. So, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, although some countries are doing better than others, there's greens, on those countries. A lot more countries, the red zones persist. They are not reporting their debt data as they should, and this will definitely lead to worse outcomes for these countries, right? It's difficult to effectively address situations that you're not monitoring. And so we respond to the big question, you know, all these issues going on around the continent, rising debt indebtedness, lack of technical capacity, issues around debt transparency. How do we now mitigate the data and expertise gap? And the response is by establishing an African debt monitoring mechanism. So the African debt monitoring mechanism will have um, 3 objectives. First, to ensure reliable and transparent access to data on public debt. Second, to provide expert analysis, which would support dialogue and decision making on public debt. And then third, to serve as a capacity building tool, particularly for debt management offices. In our attempts to establish the African debt monitoring mechanism, how far have we come? Where are we now? So, just to provide a bit of a background, the idea of the African debt monitoring mechanism was started within the African Union in February of 2022. So, the African Union had an executive council decision to establish a monitoring mechanism that will monitor domestic and external debts. So this is the brainchild of the African Union, right? And then first AU, the Frederick Ebert Stiftung African Union Cooperation Office, in its wisdom, has decided to partner with the African Union to ensure that this brainchild is this idea is brought into reality. And so I was contracted to develop a concept note to conceptualize the idea after the decision was made. And in July of 2022, at the Fifth African Union Specialized Technical Committee meeting, we presented this idea to member states, and it was welcomed. However, member states requested that we do a pre-feasibility study. What will be the implications? How would it partner well with sister institutions? The Start Afrique, for instance. There are other institutions that are already active in the space, the UNECA, AFDB. How will it partner well with the institutions? What will be the human resource implications? Questions like that. And so we developed the pre-feasibility study, and in July of 2023, at the 6th African Union Specialized Technical Committee meeting, the pre-feasibility study was presented to a small group of individuals that will play the role of key champions, in helping us navigate the um, the member states and ensuring that we bring as many member states on board. Why are we having webinars such as this? We're doing this for several reasons. First, to gain the buy-in and improve the understanding of the mechanism among key stakeholders. So key stakeholders such as peer institutions, the United Nations, the AFDB, the populace as well, debt experts, academia, debt experts, academia, the research community. Second, to leverage the support and collaboration of other technical assistance providers. We're going to be providing capacity building courses, right? So we don't intend for the African debt monitoring mechanism to stand in isolation. We want to work with other organizations, the African Economic Research Consortium, for instance, MEMFME as well, the Macroeconomic and Financial Management Institute of Eastern and Southern Africa, that's another technical assistance provider, to execute knowledge sharing. Third, to execute knowledge sharing. So webinars like this will enable the populace, know what's going on, and as much as possible be a part of the process. Member states would respond if the populace, request for more to be done around the debt space. Fourth, to improve the uptake of the findings of the mechanism to policy, and thus improve the likelihood of achieving policy change. So this is towards policymakers. At the end of the day, the eventual outcome is to influence policy to ensure that we're not as indebted as we are right now, and countries are not facing liquidity and solvency issues. And then finally, to stimulate policy dialogue between government agencies and stakeholders working on debt issues, right? We need to be there's a lot going on the continent since the issue of rising debts has become more of a concern. But it would be great to even do more dialogues between key government agencies, not just the research community discussing these issues among themselves, but discussing it with key government stakeholders. And so, just to conclude, the African debt monitoring mechanism will be a tool of exchange of knowledge, analysis, and research on Africa's debts by providing timely, quality, and precise analysis on most debt matters, a unique statistical database to those interested in studying the mechanism of debt, and offering capacity building programs to government officials.
I would like to get Jason into the discussion. Jason, you're the executive director of Afrodat. You've worked many years on questions of debt and development. You've contributed actually a lot over the last 2 years, also on the idea of the debt mechanism. So maybe let me give you 3 questions to kick it off. Like, why is this initiative now new, or what are the new features of the initiative? Maybe the second question that we will surely also later discuss more. What's the political context where this initiative comes in at the very moment? And maybe the third one, a little bit provocative. We've seen debt issues being discussed mainly by governments. It's central banks, it's ministries, it's debt management authorities. Quite often, not even parliaments are really engaged. And so why would civil society now come into the debt discussion? What's the role of CSOs here?
Some very nice, easy questions there to kick us off. But I think let's start with the first one. What is different and about this initiative? I think there are three ways to look at the proposals that Ma has presented. The first one is the depth of the crisis and the triggers. The depth here refers to not the dollar value of the debt that many African countries are experiencing right now, but the depth in terms of the type of creditors that exist on the continent, both external and internal. External, over the last 15 to 20 years, we have seen a huge diversification of the creditor landscape away from more conventional bilateral lending to more multilateral and private and commercial lending. And so this becomes very important because what the African debt monitoring mechanism is proposing is an integration of how this creditor landscape has evolved on the external front, and to get a better understanding of what the external creditor landscape looks like. But internally, what is also interesting is the rate of domestic debt and the extent to which this is also proving to be a significant challenge for many African countries. And as on the risk map that Ma has presented, the ADMM then supposes or proposes a way of coordinating in a coherent way measures, indicators, instruments, and policies that can be used to support domestic credit, from being tracked and monitored in a coherent way. So I think this is the first one, this understanding that the creditor diversification, both in the external and internal dimensions, has changed quite significantly. The second one is the multiplicity of crisis and the interconnectedness of where the debt burden falls on African countries. Throughout the last 20, 25 years, a particular type of developmental model that has promoted liberalization, credit finance, debt finance as a model for development hasn't really resulted in the significant or major transformation of the continent, and indeed actually has made the continent extremely vulnerable to different types of crises. Initially, it was, trade, it was economic and financial related crises. But as we've seen in the last 10 or so years, we've had COVID-19, we now have Ukraine, Russia, we have the Middle East problems. And you can see very much that, even global security or insecurity is having a significant impact on the continent and deepening the debt crisis on the continent, because we have become so reliant on importing some basic goods into the continent and borrowing in order to do that. So that is an important dimension in understanding why then this ADMM is very important. The third one is political, and I'll link this to the political context question that you have mentioned. As many countries have started, since COVID-19, entering this phase of extreme debt distress, many African leaders have stood up and said that the global financial architecture is not working for the continent. They've further gone on to say even the debt architecture, even though it has been posited as a transformative architecture for Africa, is still not working, especially in times of crisis, as we've seen. We've got also challenges with different actors in the architecture, whether it is arbitration, whether it is credit rating agencies. All of these actors in the debt architecture have led to a political pronouncement by African leaders and heads of state specifically that this architecture is not fit for purpose, and therefore an alternative becomes very important. And I think this is why the resolution was then passed, in this appreciation that we needed to do something and present an alternative to this. You recall the lamentations of the inadequacies of the special drawing rights issuance that was done 2 years ago, the very short-term duration of the debt suspension service initiative, the DSSI, at the peak of COVID-19, and also now the very structural weaknesses of the common framework that was at that time advanced by the G20, now the G21. So I think politically, this is a good moment for the African Union Commission to flex a bit of political muscle, flex a bit of technical savviness in trying to get this mechanism through its system, through the policy channels, and bring in other Pan-African institutions and multilateral agencies like the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, the African Development Bank, all of whom are also integral in trying to promote a more unified and comprehensive African debt architecture. Why is this important then for civil society organizations to be involved in this conversation? Well, apart from being very proactive noisemakers, I think what has happened is civil society organizations have begun to connect the dots between the debt crisis, a political crisis, and a social crisis that is currently happening on the continent. We, as a continent, run the risk of missing out on the demographic dividend that we have of a young population should this debt crisis continue. We are facing an ever-growing state of reduction of investment in public services in favor for credit or debt servicing. We're seeing a erosion of governance and transparency. And I think Ma has shown this in her graphic of countries that don't have even the most basic forms of legislation on debt management and debt accountability. So I think the role of civil society continentally has become quite important in this role, in playing this watchdog role, if you like, on the one hand, in safeguarding citizens and the social contract, but on the other hand, promoting and providing a technical backstopping to the emerging issues around debt management and debt transparency. So I think for me, this is what I'll say by way of introduction, just to say why this is an important moment, and to thank FES AU, our colleagues at the African Union Commission and UNECA as well for, having this conversation at this very pivotal time.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you very much for that kickoff. So let me turn to you now, Chawi. You're an economic affairs officer at the UNECA here in Addis, at the macroeconomics policy department. And you've also intensely followed debt discussions on the continent. And in fact, UNECA is working with several member states on debt issues. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about UNECA's work on debt and how that also maybe relates to and how you join forces with the African Union. And maybe secondly, where you see the ADMM coming in as a new initiative and where it, in your view, would fill a gap that is still there.
Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. My name is Chao Yu Hu. I'm with the Macroeconomics and Governance Division of UNECA here. Thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation on ADMM. I would like to first congratulate you for the progress that you have achieved in establishing this mechanism, which is much needed on this continent. So regarding the questions from Alex, I just want to highlight some points here. First, I do agree with you 100% that we need a localized homegrown solution on debt, which the ADMM is aiming at. So the recent global economic conditions after COVID-19 and the Ukraine war makes African countries more difficult to get debt relief. And the recent trend of debt restructuring has shown that the creditors prefer more of the extension of debt maturity and interest cost cut rather than simply writing off the debt. So it's a difficult time for us. It's also a difficult time for the creditors as well. So we cannot expect any more for debt cancellation. And the two international initiatives on that, which we are all very familiar with, the DSSI and also the Common Framework, have not worked quite well and did not lead to a real deduction in debt, which shows that the international remedy might not work so well. So what we really need here is a localized solution for debt sustainability. And that leads to my second point, which is we need to enhance our local capacity on debt issues, which is also the ADMM is aiming at. So as is discussed by Ma, I think the changing of the composition of Africa's debt market makes it harder to report. So there has been a changing composition, a diversification of creditors with more debt from non-Paris Club creditors such as China and also private creditors through the issuance of bond. And the bond issuance will require specific knowledge and a skill set, and not to mention the urgent need on this continent for skills in debt restructuring negotiation, and also the skills to carry out the debt sustainability analysis. Currently, it's only the World Bank and IMF who has the defining power on this. So all of this has put us in a very passive position in restructuring our debt. So building local capacity is really imperative here. And also, as is mentioned by the presentation and also mentioned by Jason, the AU has recently obtained the membership of G20, which offers us a unique opportunity to come up with a common position on debt and also effectively negotiate for ourselves. And in this recent annual meeting in Morocco, the IMF has also agreed to add a seat for Sub-Saharan Africa in its executive board. So the SSA now has 3 executive board members instead of 2. So this is also a unique opportunity for us to increase the representation for Africa in the international decision-making power. So again, this would require that we do the basics right first. We need to develop our local technical capacity for that. So the ADMM is a great initiative, and it is also a very timely initiative. It comes at a time when we really need to take initiative and also seek for solutions on our own. It can also serve a catalytic role here and also build a solid foundation for AU to come up with a localized solution on debt restructuring. It also aims at establishing a unique database on debt and aiming at covering the types of debt that has less attention before, such as the domestic debt, the SOE debt, and also Chinese loans, which could also bridge the data gap here. And also it could offer the much needed training program to member states on debt statistics, debt restructuring, negotiation, and also bond issuance. So let me also take this opportunity to brief you what ECA has been doing on debt issues. So from our side at ECA, we have been working closely with the member states to enhance their efforts for debt sustainability. At the regional level, we advocate for the international community to provide more liquidity for Africa. We advocate for the reform of the global financial architecture, including enhancing the current common framework and reforming the IMF quota system and the special drawing rights system to facilitate more SDR reallocation. We also focus on green financing, which is also an important instrument for debt restructuring here. We initiated the Sustainable Debt Coalition and promote debt for nature swaps, blended financing, and also climate financing. On the country level, we are also helping member states on their debt management strategy, DSA, and also debt statistics compilation. We do this through the peer-to-peer learning workshops and study tours. And we work with countries such as Ethiopia, Zambia, Sierra Leone, and South Africa. I think I'll stop here and happy to discuss further, but let me emphasize again that there is a lot that we can work together for this issue, and we are very happy to be part of this initiative. Thank you very much. Back to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Chaoyi. Well, I think we have a pretty good overview from this initial round and the inputs. And I would like to open up actually now to the other participants, to the audience, to well, raise questions or come in with comments, remarks, further ideas on the ADMM proposal, but also like more in general on the debt question. There is one question on how this relates or how the debt question is related also to the proposal of a credit rating agency. That is being discussed very intensely at the moment, a continental or African continental credit rating agency. Maybe Jason, do you want to come in on that? And then I have another question on, well, how do actually governments feel about this? Are they do they consider this an affront when the AU takes a lead on debt issues? Maybe Chawi or Ma, you want to come in on that question? And well, let's start with you, Jason, and then I hand over to Chawi and Ma.
Sure, thank you. And thank you very much for the questions that have come through. Very provocative and penetrating in terms of how we do this. With the credit rating agency proposal for an African one, I think you're right. I think both of these proposals need to work in tandem. But there's one important thing to keep in mind from a political economy analysis is what indications are we sending out when we say we want our own credit rating agencies? Essentially, we are or might be proposing a maintenance of the status quo in terms of a debt finance and heavy external private finance development model, because as it were, we would want to have good ratings, from that agency. So the issue of private finance and debt finance as a model still may persist, and we may want to think about that closely. But I think on the other hand, what is positive about the ADMM is that it offers us an opportunity to integrate a more transparent and accountable indicators around how the credit agencies actually work. Because one of the lamentations on the continent has been how the existing credit rating agencies artificially rank or measure the risk on the continent, which then makes borrowing extremely expensive. So I think there's two ways of looking at this, and I think there is an opportunity in the African debt monitoring mechanism to ensure that there is a better, fairer, more transparent and accountable way of doing credit risk rating. But I also feel that it is important that we don't get caught up in the idea of a credit risk rating agency, but really stick to the fundamentals of trying to develop a more productive base-led economy that is on domestic resource mobilization and so on. So I think there are pros and cons, but really we should be looking at a more broader perspective on finance on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for this first one. Ma and Chawi, let me give you two questions from the chat. There was one question on, or let me read that out because it's short. Would this mechanism not be perceived as an affront to the sovereignty of governments, countries? That is one question. Another question was in French, and it is about distributing and disseminating the idea of the ADMM. So what is the strategy and how to get like ownership among governments? I think that's a very critical point. Who wants to go first? Ma, you're already unmuted, so it looks like you have a lot to say on that.
I'm happy to go first. Great questions. I'll just touch a bit on the ones that I've read, the ones that you've mentioned as well, Alex. So with regards to whether the African Union's intervention in the debt space will be seen as an affront to member states, no, I don't think it's going to be seen as the African Union impinging on member state sovereignty, right? For several reasons. So first, in the process of working on the ADMM, we learned that debt forgiveness is actually done at the continent level and not, at the national level. So, to a large extent, the African Union is within its rights to want to know better about the debt situation, among its member states. And then, secondly, at these meetings, member states are well represented. You know, at the higher levels, nearly all member states are represented. So it's not the case where this is being done behind the backs of member states. Member states are active participants to the decisions being made. So that's for that question. Um, for the question of the credit rating agency, I just want to piggyback on the points that Jason made. So for me, having attended a couple of these AU meetings, one lesson that I have learned from the uh, uh, from the developments around the credit rating agency is the lobbying among member states, right? So apart from the economic side, there's a lot of lobbying that goes on. A lot of the times, new interventions are shut down if you're not well prepared. If you don't have your stuff together, a lot of interventions are shut down. Not only credit rating agencies, there are a lot more institutions that are coming up. Investment Observatory, several related institutions. So for me, that's one lesson that I have learned. There's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of lobbying among member states, which is why we're going through this route to bring on board CSOs, bring on board as many stakeholders, key stakeholders within the debt landscape, so that our idea, despite it being birthed by the African Union, gets accepted by member states. So there was a third question you asked, Alex, on the one
that was on the strategy of disseminating among governments, so to get like more ownership among governments, African governments, for the initiative.
Okay, great. You may even be better positioned to respond to that, Alex. What we've been doing are, apart from the discussions on the floor of the African Union meetings, we've also been doing having round table sessions is one strategy that we're using. These are informal sessions with member states where we explain the idea in the most granular detail, get feedback from member states, and then go back to the drawing board to tweak the mechanism to suit the needs of member states. Also, webinars like this, it would interest you to know that some policymakers will be tuned in, listening to the idea, and then getting feedback from them. So those are some strategies that we're using.
Thank you very much, Ma. Chawi, do you want to come in here on the governments?
Thank
Since
you.
you work mainly with governments, right?
Thank you, Alex. I think Ma has touched upon a lot on these two questions. So let me just maybe add some from my perspective. So first of all, I think the ADMM is actually a platform for knowledge sharing and exchange. And also it aims at establishing a comprehensive database on debt. So the ADMM will act under the data management framework of AU, and it will also act based on the rule of data transparency. So I don't think there will be any violation of sovereignties here. And not to mention, we keep on emphasizing the representation and the participation from the member states. And also, I think we need to really set up our priorities here because, the recent global economic condition has been really gloomy. And we, especially African countries, have been facing shocks from COVID-19 and Ukraine crisis. And this is a compounded shock, actually. So it's really, we are facing a debt crisis here. And we need, it's a matter of economic recovery. It's also a matter of sustainability. So I think what we need to do here is really put forward the priorities here and just get hands-on to it. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you, Chawi. I see that there are like two hands raised right now, and I would like to introduce them. Maybe you get ready already, Eliman Diouf and Enoch. But before introducing them, let me refer to one comment. I think that's a very important one by Monsieur Apollinaire, that we need to engage legislators, that we need to engage parliaments. I can inform you that we did that last week. There was a big meeting in Nairobi of members of parliament from all over Africa. And we had a session together with Aphrodite and the AU on the ADMM and discussed it with legislators and the parliaments. And we also have, I think, a number of honorable members of parliament among us here in the webinar. So very happy to see that as well. So Eliman Diouf, the floor is yours. Could you briefly introduce yourself and then keep your question or comment, please, short?
Bonjour, je suis Eliman Diouf de la Confédération des syndicats autonomes du Sénégal.
How will civil society organizations be able to work at regional level and continental level? Will they operate as an independent structure within their respective countries, or will they work directly with the African Union?
Okay, thank you very much, Eliman. And we have a second hand from Enoch.
Okay, great. I'm Enoch from Transparency International Rwanda. I'm a senior researcher. Especially, I concentrate on the cluster of economics. I would like to commend this initiative of ADMM as it will complement other activities that we have implemented earlier with TI Kenya and other chapters on domestic resources mobilization since 2019, I think. My colleague will mind. But as we are talking about something which is very important and that we expect from it to contribute to leverage resources, normally we have to take both sides. That is my recommendation. Some speakers, they have mentioned what really the world is facing, even the continent. But I would like to suggest that also the financing side has to come on board, and
sorry, there is now an interpretation in the channel, a mix again.
We try to see how we can reconcile both sides. We can advocate both sides. As we are talking about shocks, global crisis, continental, it is clear that there are some shocks really that will need mutual understanding and collaboration. So as this initiative talks about monitoring, if we talk only about monitoring, government will tend too much to understand that we are sticking too much on the accountable use of debts or available resources, instead of helping them to see how they can go for the alternative, what Choi has called localized or homegrown solutions that they have to go for or to look for. So to be brief, we can see how this initiative will reconcile the financing side and the demand and the supply side in order to implement it and get the intended or achieve the intended impact.
So then I'll give it back to, Jason, do you want to start with, was the question first on the CSOs?
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the two questions. So on the role of civil society organizations, of course, this is there's a sequence in how we're working on this, and there are Pan-African organizations like the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, AFRODET, that are Pan-African civil society organizations that can engage both at the regional and continental level. The important thing is that we find entry points to not only engage with the officials and the policy processes at the African Union Commission level or the regional economic level, but also at the national level. And this is where the push from both sides becomes very important. So that network of civil society organizations does exist. We have been around for quite a long time, but as I mentioned before, this is a very pivotal opportunity for us as civil society organizations to be part of this process. On the issue raised by Enoch on the diversification of development finance and how this ADMM fits in here and the risks related to just monitoring, I think we need to look at it in two main ways. What does monitoring actually do, and in what ways does it enable other forms of finance to be leveraged? Number one, at the continental level, it presents an opportunity for a coordinated and coherent approach to collection, analysis, and positioning on issues of public debt at a continental level. And this cannot be underestimated, I think, as Shawi and Ma have stated, about what that can do in terms of collective bargaining and collective negotiations. Actually, one of the reasons we are struggling so much as a continent is because there is a lack of harmony, coordination, and coherence when it comes to debt negotiations. And so what the ADMM on this level or at this level can achieve is that support towards coherence and coordination. And the spillover effect or impact of that is you can then understand how to leverage different forms of finance, how to determine where the productive capacity of debt actually exists within the African ecosystem, and then generate domestic resource mobilization. At the national and regional level, what the ADMM monitoring mechanism does is that it implants at the national and regional level this idea that you, as countries and as regions deepen their integration, their fiscal monetary policies start to be harmonized, not just at the including the data collection aspects of it. So if you look at the East African community, for instance, that espouses to have a common currency and move towards a deeper economic integration, something like the ADMM provides a baseline or a foundation for member states to start looking into in terms of coordinated and coherent data collection and agreeing on harmonizing of statistics. I should say that the ADMM, one of the wonderful things about it is that it is anchored also in the African Union's data consensus that dates back to the late 90s, early 2000s. And so there is also a political aspiration within that about a collection of statistics and harmonized methodologies for collecting economic, social, political statistics across the continent. So there is that, and I think that is how we start to see and appreciate the importance of how this then creates the pathway for leveraging other forms of development finance. And I also hope, Alex, this has also touched on Wangira's question on the role of economic blocks as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. Thank you very much, Jason. I would like to pick out two questions from our chat. One is on the understanding of the debt situation, or rather like among governments or African leaders. Is there, if African leaders or like some government leaders are in denial that there is a debt a debt crisis or a debt burden for the country, how can we solve the situation, and how can we get them on board? I would like to give this to Chawi, since I think you have quite a lot of experience with working with African governments who are maybe sometimes have to be convinced that that level is unsustainable. And the second question was on the ADMM link with growing advocacy for implementation of accrual double accounting system for debt monitoring. I think this is a good question for our expert Ma. Apollinaire also raised his hand. Apollinaire, you have the floor.
Yes. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Apollinaire from Burundi, Civic Initiative for Environment and Sustainable Development, ICD. So it's just a comment. I have written it down in your questions. So I was just saying that this initiative is very important in our campaign for economic justice, as it will allow us to have accurate data. So therefore, my recommendation is always to build synergy between political will, if there is one, and research and advocacy for us to be able to implement this tool. And also, I would like to add that in Burundi, we are appreciative of effort support in developing homegrown solutions in our advocacy work for public debt accountability and domestic resource mobilizations.
Thank you very much, Apollinaire. Well, then I would give it now back to Chawi. The question on, how easy or difficult is it to work with governments that might be not, it was put in the questions, so I just quote, that might be sometimes maybe in denial of a debt distress situation. Have you faced that problem, or how do you deal with that?
Thank you very much, Alex. Let me first provide some comments on the comment from one participant, I think, on the domestic resource mobilization. So I think everything we have been discussing here is trying to leverage more resources for Africa, trying to leverage more liquidities and also attract more low-cost financing. So we talk about the debt issues, and also we talk about reforming the global financial architecture, which is more from the external side. But we also need to focus more on the domestic side, which is a domestic resource mobilization. So at the UNECA, we also work a lot with member states on domestic resource mobilization and also tackling illicit financial flows. And we also worked a lot with AU for this. But I do agree with the participant that there is a mismatch of the demand and the supply here. So I think by joining the G20 as a new member, maybe the AU could in a better position and have better opportunity to elaborate more of our need and also help to shape a new, like a better solution for our debt issues. And the ADMM can also contribute a lot in here. So about the question of a denial of the debt crisis, I think it's just a matter of how you put it, because the debt level is there. We can tell from the statistics, and the issues is there. So whether a crisis or not, we still need to deal with this issue. We still need to repay our debt, and which is urgent problem facing on this continent. But I do agree with you, because the current issue or the current question and the solution is still defined by the international community. So the debt level and the debt restructuring solutions is defined by the DSA, and is also defined by the debt carrying capacity, which is done by the IMF and the World Bank, still from the international community. So I think maybe we could think of alternatives, which is also mentioned a lot by the panelists and also the participants. We could think of alternatives to restructure our debt. We could also think of alternatives to analyze our debt. And I think, for example, we could even think out of the box, because currently the emergence of the BRICS countries, especially China, as the largest bilateral donor now, may open some more financing opportunities for Africa. So I think really now we need to be open to everything, and we need to make the basics right, and we need to think for sustainability. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Chawi. And well, Ma, I give the other question to you.
So, like the question mentioned, there's been a move towards accrual accounting as opposed to cash accounting in several countries for several reasons, right? So, accrual accounting has the potential to capture contingent liabilities. It also takes a whole of government approach, where the consolidated debts from all government entities are recorded, right? And so in recent times, it's been gaining traction among debt management offices. And before now, we had not really thought about how to link the ADMM to the use of accrual accounting, just because that decision depends on the debt management office in question, right? However, it's worthy, it's noteworthy, and it will be great for us to incorporate it into the recommendations we have for debt management offices.
Thank you very much, Ma. Then, well, there was another question about an African economic conference here in Addis in November. I'm not so sure whether I am aware of it, but if anyone has an information about that, and it looks like Shem knows about it, then Shem, please enlighten us with that. And afterwards, I would give it back to our three panelists for a final round.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Actually, I raised my hand before that. It's just I saw a question from a member of parliament. Actually, I thought it would be fair to pick it up, given that just when initially handled the issue of political involvement and political participation in the process, and I know Honorable Abisai is just asking, because I can see members of parliament are here, many of them, just to give clarity on how the members of parliament will be involved, the practical involvement in the process from the beginning to the end, because they feel that they will have to play a critical role on the ADMM process. So maybe, Jason, if you don't mind, just to elaborate a bit, given that you already talked about this before.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, Honorable Abisai, for the question. I think legislators play an extremely important role in getting the political buy-in of the ADMM at the national level, because ultimately when member states are preparing for meetings of the STC or the African Union Summit in the early parts of next year, you know, these legislators have very close political connections, not only to the government bureaucracy, but also to the executive. And so in this regard, they play a very important role in advocating at the national level politically for why this is important, given the debt situation that many of our countries are facing. So yes, and part of the engagement, I think both Ma and Alex have referenced in the presentations, is that this is a key area of investment that the organizations and partners in this process are putting in to ensure at the national level legislators and the executive are well aware. I think lastly, just to say that, we are also going to be looking at champion member states who can take this through the policy process at the African Union level. And, we would welcome, particularly from honorable members, suggestions and recommendations on how this can work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks, Shem, for raising that point. I think that is very important. We will share with you also information after this webinar. So we will send information by email and try to keep you in the loop on how to go forward. I would like to close this with giving the chance to our three panelists, maybe for an inspiring closing remark. And I would have like one question, and feel free to say something about it or not. We heard before, and we briefly touched upon the new G20 membership of the AU. What do you expect from the AU, how to use this membership with regard to the debt question? I don't know who wants to start. It's the final round. Everyone has like maximum 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Honorable Abisai, for the question. I think legislators play an extremely important role in getting the political buy-in of the ADMM at the national level, because ultimately when member states are preparing for meetings of the STC or the African Union Summit in the early parts of next year, these legislators have very close political connections, not only to the government bureaucracy, but also to the executive. And so in this regard, they play a very important role in advocating at the national level politically for why this is important, given the debt situation that many of our countries are facing. So yes, and part of the engagement, I think both Ma and Alex have referenced in the presentations, is that this is a key area of investment that the organizations and partners in this process are putting in to ensure at the national level legislators and the executive are well aware. I think lastly, just to say that, we are also going to be looking at champion member states who can take this through the policy process at the African Union level. And, we would welcome, particularly from honorable members, suggestions and recommendations on how this can work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks, Shem, for raising that point. I think that is very important. We will share with you also information after this webinar. So we will send information by email and try to keep you in the loop on how to go forward. I would like to close this with giving the chance to our three panelists, maybe for an inspiring closing remark. And I would have like one question, and feel free to say something about it or not. We heard before, and we briefly touched upon the new G20 membership of the AU. What do you expect from the AU, how to use this membership with regard to the debt question? I don't know who wants to start. It's the final round. Everyone has like maximum 1 minute.
So first off, the comment you made about the African Economic Conference. Yeah, it's going to be held in Ethiopia, Addis. It's organized by the UNDP, UNECA, and AFDB. They do it every year for economists across the continent to present papers and also listen to panel discussions, recent insights or recent developments in the space. This year's conference theme is on industrialization. So it's not on debts. 2 years ago it was on debts, or rather a year ago it was on debts. If you can attend the conference if you're in Addis. It's a great opportunity. So moving on to the question that Alex asked, what do we expect from the African Union in its new role? I would say more, better, and equitable finance for member states, right? So pushing for more, better, and equitable finance. More in terms of volume. We're not getting as much finance, development finance, as we should. Better in terms of linking it to our development agenda, climate and development agenda, and then equitable in terms of the terms that we get, comparing the terms that we get this finance with other countries. It has to be as equitable as possible. It's been a great conversation so far. I have been able to tease out ideas that will be used for the feasibility study, from the question on the accrual accounting to the role each stakeholder would play, whether it's members of parliament to CSOs. So thank you so much, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Ma, and Chawi. Thank you, Ma, and Chawi.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you very much for the much intriguing questions. So talking about the way forward for ADMM, I think, again, there's a lot that we can work together. For example, we, from our side, we suggest that we could consider to establish a peer learning mechanism for member states, because we work a lot with the member states in terms of peer learning. So, and it proved to be very effective. And we should focus more on learning from the homegrown best practices on this continent. Also, we could, as is discussed a lot, we could establish a comprehensive database which covers the type of debt which is less focused before, such as domestic debt, Chinese loans, and state-owned enterprises debt. And there seems to be some data gaps here, especially on China's loans to Africa. So it will be of great reference for us to focus more on this new trend, new creditors, and new approaches. Also, we could prioritize capacity building program, especially on areas such as negotiations, enhancing credit rating, and also sovereign bond issuance, especially climate bond issuance. And also, we could consider to include creditors in the stakeholder mapping. The creditors could serve as observers, and also they can provide external sources for data and training. Regarding your question on the AU joining G20, to me, I think G20 needs Africa just as much as Africa needs the G20. Thinking of the number of countries in Africa, the geographic coverage, and also the represented population here. We all know the G20 is the most powerful decision-making mechanisms here, and it's also a platform for global governance and also a platform for tackling with global challenges. And without the representation of Africa, the G20's decisions and the solutions will not be relevant enough and also responsive enough to meet the need for African countries. And with AU's membership, the G20 can become a truly participatory mechanism and also effective multilateral instrument without being biased with the mindset from the North. But again, this requires that, as we discussed a lot, this requires the AU to be well prepared to develop a strategy, a common strategy for our own, and also to be well prepared to know what is really happening in here, especially on debt issues, which requires lots of local capacities. Also, I think the AU should also think beyond the continent, taking a more active role in the global governance and taking the full responsibility of being a G20 member instead of just focusing on the issues of Africa. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Chawi. And Jason, you have the power of the last word. Thank you, Ma, and Chawi.
Thank you very much. I think on the potential of the ADMM, I would like to assert that it's beyond just a mechanism for enhancing debt transparency and accountability. It's a political instrument that can be used to demonstrate how coordinated, coherent, and deliberate the African continent is on dealing and addressing with its debt situation. It need not only be a crisis related mechanism, it could also be a mechanism that is used to politically advance Africa's position in its negotiations on trade, economics, politics, and so on. And I think dovetailing what Chawi and Ma said is that perhaps, if there is this such sort of mechanism, the power of African voice in global decision-making spaces becomes even stronger. We might be a little bit at odds as to whether the G21 is better with the African Union or not, but I think that the principle that a coordinated and coherent African voice means that we can move towards making Africa a rule maker and not a rule taker, which is, at the heart of what this idea and many other initiatives are about. I think lastly, it's also to remember that this initiative is also very much in line with Agenda 2063. It is not in line with the Abuja Treaty that seeks to establish an African financial architecture. And so all of this is foundation work towards creating that agency and that autonomy of the African continent when it comes to issues of finance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma and Chawi. Thank you, Jason, and thank you all.